Not every car deserves to be remembered, and some from Britain were so bad, so dangerous, or so strange that they ended up banned. These weren't legends, they were mistakes on wheels. Cars that regulators, racers, and even drivers wanted gone as fast as possible. Ugly, unreliable, and unsafe, they proved that not every British car was a classy Aston or a sleek Jaguar. Here are the 13 ultra-banned British cars you won't believe were real. Disasters that should have never existed. Stick around till the end, and don't forget to subscribe. The 1973 Reliant Robin was the sort of car that has gone down in history not as a proud representative of British engineering, but as the ultimate punchline in the world of motoring. It is the car everyone laughs at, the car that television shows like Top Gear roll over again and again for entertainment. The car that school children would point at on the street and giggle about. It was cheap, it was light, it was efficient on paper, and yet it was so catastrophically flawed that by the late 1970s and early 1980s, it was less a form of transportation and more a rolling cultural joke. The Robin wasn't merely a century later, people still shudder or smirk when they hear the name. Its appearance alone sealed its fate. The Robin was short, narrow, and awkwardly tall for its wheelbase, with a single wheel mounted at the front that carried both steering and directional duties. The body, made of fiberglass to save weight and costs, looked flimsy, fragile, and utterly disposable, like a toy car scaled up to human size. Painted in dull, uninspiring colors and with proportions that gave it the visual balance of a broken egg, the Robin was an aesthetic disaster. Where Italian designers of the era were producing sleek, flowing GTs and Britain's own Jaguar was crafting elegant saloons, Reliant delivered something that looked like it had been designed in a garage with a ruler and little sense of grace. It wasn't just homely, it was hideous. People didn't buy Robins because they liked them, they bought them because they had no other choice. And that was the key. The Robin's entire existence was predicated on a loophole. Because it had 3 wheels, it wasn't technically considered a car by the British government. It fell into a motorcycle classification, meaning owners could get away with paying lower taxes, and in some cases, could even drive it on a motorcycle license. To the cash-strapped working class of 1970s Britain, still reeling from the oil crisis and ongoing inflation, this was an attractive offer. The Robin was cheap to buy, cheap to run, and sipped fuel at a time when petrol prices were climbing fast. But what good is saving a few pounds at the pump if the vehicle you're driving terrifies you every time you approach a corner? That was the Robin's fatal flaw, its instability. Every single owner knew the truth. The car was prone to tipping over. The physics of it were unavoidable. With its narrow track width, tall body, and single wheel doing all the steering up front, the car behaved like a circus act on stilts. At modest speeds, driving in a straight line, it was tolerable. But attempt to change lanes suddenly, take a corner with even a hint of enthusiasm, or misjudge a roundabout, and the Robin had a terrifying habit of lifting its inside wheel and tumbling over like a toy tricycle. It flipped so easily that even cautious drivers lived with a gnawing sense of dread. Many owners admitted they deliberately slowed to a crawl around bends, creating traffic jams behind them. The glass body offered virtually no crash protection. It shattered in collisions, leaving occupants frighteningly exposed. In many ways, it was a disposable car, one built not to last, but to function just enough to justify its low price tag. Public opinion was merciless. Robin drivers were mocked by neighbors, heckled by children, and shunned by enthusiasts. Owning one was an admission of desperation, a signal that you could not afford a proper car. In a nation that had produced everything from the Jaguar E-Type to the Mini Cooper, The Reliant Robin felt like a cruel joke. By the 1980s, it had become so infamous that while it was never officially banned, it was effectively outlawed by society itself. Nobody respected it, nobody wanted to be seen in it, and those who drove it often did so with a mixture of shame and stubborn practicality. And yet, despite the ridicule, the Robin lingers in history because it is unforgettable. You cannot talk about bad cars, about ugly cars, about unsafe cars without the Reliant Robin coming up almost immediately. It has cemented itself as a cultural artifact, as much part of Britain's automotive history as the glamorous icons of Jaguar, Aston Martin, or Rolls-Royce, albeit for the exact opposite reasons. One former owner put it bluntly in an interview years later. "I didn't own a car, I owned a Reliant Robin. There's a difference. I spent every day hoping it wouldn't roll, hoping no one saw me getting out of it, and praying it would start. It was less transportation, more humiliation on wheels." The 1973 Reliant Robin remains the ugliest duckling of British motoring, remembered less as a vehicle and more as a national joke. It was lightweight, fuel efficient, and technically practical, but it was also hideous, fragile, and dangerous. Even now, half a century later, it is impossible to see one without smirking, proof that some cars are not defined by performance or luxury, but by the sheer scale of their failure. Would you like me to make the Reliant Robin story even longer in a cinematic narrative style, describing what it felt like to step inside one, the fear of approaching corners, the embarrassment of being seen in it, and the sheer absurdity of owning Britain's most mocked car? The 1970 Bond Bug 700 ES is one of those strange, almost surreal chapters in motoring history that makes you wonder whether the designers were visionaries, pranksters, or simply out of their minds. It was born out of Britain's obsession with doing things differently, built in the same eccentric spirit that gave the world the Reliant Robin, only this time with a youthful, rebellious twist. Where the Robin was sold to practical, frugal families who couldn't afford a real car, the Bug was aimed directly at young people, the daring, swinging generation of the early 70s who wanted something to stand out from their parents' boring sedans. Instead of safe, practical, and conventional, the Bond Bug promised wild styling, futuristic features, and a chance to be noticed. And noticed you were, though not always for the right reasons. Imagine it, a bright, shocking orange wedge rolling down a dull British road lined with Morris Marinas and Aston Maxis. It looked like a toy that had somehow escaped from a Hot Wheels track. The body was fiberglass, the front end impossibly low, the canopy door lifting forward like something from a jet fighter. Passers-by would stop and stare, mouths open. Children loved it, teenagers pointed at it, and older drivers shook their heads in disbelief. It was daring, it was bold, it was utterly impractical, and that impracticality would define its short, chaotic life. At its heart, the Bug was nothing more than a Reliant Regal in fancy dress. Under the wedge bodywork sat the same tiny 700cc four-cylinder engine, producing a wheezy 29 horsepower. To make up for its lack of muscle, it relied on light weight, just about 440 kilograms, which gave it just enough pep to reach 75 miles per hour if you had the courage to take it there. Because here was the problem. With 3 wheels, one up front and 2 at the rear, the handling was never, ever predictable. You could be cruising along happily, smiling at the attention you were getting, when suddenly you hit a corner too quickly and felt the entire car lean like a drunken cyclist. Push harder and the Bug could tip, wobble, or roll completely. It wasn't just unstable, it was downright terrifying in the wrong hands. Owners quickly learned that you didn't drive a Bug so much as survive it. The interior was another adventure. Entry was through the single front canopy, dramatic to watch, but infuriating in practice.
If the gas struts wore out, you had to lift the whole thing with brute force. If you parked nose first in a garage or close to a wall, congratulations, you were trapped because there were no side doors. Rain was a constant enemy. Water loved to drip through the seals and down onto your lap. Inside, it was cramped and bare. 2 tiny bucket seats with almost no storage, and a dashboard that looked like it came from a toy. Yet for all of its cheapness, the Bug was not cheap to buy. At nearly 600 pounds in 1970, it cost almost as much as a Mini, which was faster, safer, and infinitely more practical. You paid for the style and the statement, but the statement often turned out to be, "I've made a terrible mistake." Socially, the Bug was just as unstable as it was mechanically. For a few shining months, it had a strange cult coolness about it. Some young drivers loved the cheeky, rebellious image. One former owner recalled, "It felt like I was driving the future, at least until it rained and the canopy leaked on my trousers." Others weren't so generous. Neighbors laughed, girlfriends refused to ride in it, and parents worried for their children's lives. Insurance companies weren't fooled either. Premiums were higher than you'd expect for such a small machine because its accident record quickly became notorious. Certain towns didn't want them on fast roads. Motorway driving was a gamble because while the Bug could technically keep up, its twitchy handling and feather-light weight made it feel like a death trap at speed. Within just a few years, the dream collapsed. Production never took off, and by the mid-1970s, most Bugs had vanished from daily use. They weren't banned by law, but by practicality, ridicule, and sheer survival instinct. Owners abandoned them, traded them for minis, or pushed them into barns and sheds where their fiberglass shells collected dust for decades. Some were scrapped after accidents. Others were left to rot because repairing one was more trouble than it was worth. The Bug was effectively outlawed not by government decree, but by common sense, by ridicule, and by the laws of physics. And yet, like many of the strangest cars in history, the Bond Bug 700 ES didn't disappear entirely. Instead, it found a second life as a cult oddball. Today, enthusiasts treat it almost like a museum piece of pop culture. At classic car shows, the sight of a bright orange Bug draws crowds instantly, not because people remember them fondly, but because they can't quite believe such a thing existed. Collectors pay good money for survivors, restoring them to their original shocking glory. Younger fans, raised on TV comedies and Top Gear skits, see them as lovable misfits, absurd, impractical, and completely unique. The Bond Bug was supposed to be Britain's youth car, a symbol of fun, freedom, and futuristic design. Instead, it became a punchline, a rolling cautionary tale, and a reminder that bold ideas sometimes don't survive contact with reality. It wasn't banned by law, but it was banned by common sense, by ridicule, and by the laws of physics. And yet, for all its faults, it remains unforgettable. As one former owner once put it, with a mix of frustration and nostalgia, "It wasn't a car, it wasn't a bike, it wasn't even safe, but it made me smile, right up until it tried to kill me."
The Peel 50 is not just a car. It is the pure embodiment of British eccentricity taken to its absolute extreme. A machine so tiny, so impractical, and so absurd that it's difficult to believe it was ever intended for real-world roads. Born in the early 1960s on the Isle of Man, where Peel Engineering had previously built boats and fiberglass products, the P50 was marketed as the ultimate city car. Tiny, cheap, efficient, and easy to park anywhere. On paper, it sounded almost clever. In practice, it was more like a punchline that someone accidentally mass-produced. To grasp just how insane the P50 was, you need to picture its size. At only 54 inches long, 39 inches wide, and weighing about 130 pounds, it was smaller than some office desks. It was so compact that Peel literally advertised it with the slogan, "almost cheaper than walking." They weren't joking. The car was marketed as a way to beat Britain's increasingly crowded cities, where traffic jams and lack of parking were daily frustrations. Instead of spending time circling the block, you could just roll up to your office, park your P50 on the sidewalk, or even wheel it indoors. Peel claimed this as a selling point. You could drive the P50 straight into a building and keep it in the hallway, like an umbrella stand with wheels. But the engineering was laughably crude. A tiny 49cc DKW two-stroke scooter engine, producing a feeble 4.2 horsepower, sat under its fiberglass shell. That meant, in ideal conditions, you could crawl up to a maximum of 37 miles per hour, but most owners admitted that anything above 25 miles per hour felt suicidal. The vibrations were intense, the engine screamed like a lawnmower, and the car was so light that even a gust of wind could nudge it off course. There was no suspension in the conventional sense, so every pothole or bump went directly into your spine. And let's not forget, it had 3 wheels, which meant handling was twitchy and frightening at any speed above walking pace. Then there was the infamous lack of reverse gear. Peel decided this was unnecessary, claiming the car was so light that drivers could just get out, grab the handle bolted to the rear, and drag the vehicle into position. While technically true, this was humiliating in practice. Imagine driving down a crowded street, realizing you'd overshot a parking space, climbing out, and physically hauling your car backwards while people pointed and laughed. That wasn't motoring, it was public theater. One owner described the experience bluntly. You weren't driving a car, you were dragging around a joke that burned petrol. Inside, things were even more ridiculous. The P50 was strictly a one-seater, unless you counted the possibility of stuffing a shopping bag next to your knees. The single side door was narrow, and once inside, you were wedged in tightly, knees bent awkwardly, steering wheel pressed close to your chest. There was no heater, no real ventilation, no safety features of any kind, no seatbelt, no crumple zones, nothing. If you crashed into anything larger than a bicycle, you weren't going to walk away. In fact, simply being seen in the P50 was enough of an embarrassment that many buyers avoided using them in public. Governments and insurance companies weren't fooled. While Peel insisted the P50 was fully road legal, restrictions quickly appeared. Motorways were out of the question, police would pull them off for being too slow and too dangerous. Some towns discouraged or outright banned their use in city centers because they clogged traffic. Insurance premiums were awkward to calculate, with some providers charging surprisingly high rates simply because the cars had no proven safety record. To make matters worse, they broke down frequently thanks to the crude scooter engine and fragile drivetrain. What was supposed to be the future of urban motoring became a symbol of impractical silliness, unfit for real life. Socially, the P50 never shook its image as a joke. Kids pointed and laughed, pedestrians mocked, and other drivers treated it with contempt. If you drove one in the 1960s, you weren't seen as futuristic. You were seen as desperate, eccentric, or insane. It wasn't banned by law, but it was banned from respectability. Even among Britain's strange microcar boom of the post-war years, the Peel P50 stood out as the most impractical of the bunch. While cars like the Mini, Citroën 2CV, and Fiat 500 proved that small could be brilliant, the Peel P50 proved that small could also be ridiculous. Production numbers tell the story. Only about 50 were built between 1962 and 1965, and the company folded soon after. Most disappeared into sheds, barns, or scrapyards, often abandoned after short ownership because living with one was simply unbearable. Survivors became rarities, and decades later collectors began to hunt them down, not for their quality, but for their absurdity. Today, a Peel P50 is worth a small fortune at auction, often fetching over $100,000, not because it's a great car, but because it's a novelty, a piece of history so bizarre that people can't resist owning it. In the modern era, the P50 has achieved cult fame. Jeremy Clarkson famously drove one around the BBC offices on Top Gear, squeezing into elevators and rolling past confused coworkers. That moment cemented its place in pop culture. People laugh at it now, but in its own time, the P50 was laughed off the roads for being completely unfit for purpose. It wasn't just small, it was too small to succeed, too silly to be practical, and too fragile to be safe. The Peel P50 was never really banned by governments alone. It was banned by reality itself. It was banned by the laws of physics, by ridicule, and by the fact that walking was often faster, safer, and more dignified. It remains today as one of the strangest and most infamous cars ever built. A rolling reminder that sometimes innovation crosses the line into absurdity. Would you like me to do the same kind of long, brutal write-up on the Messerschmitt KR200, another infamous microcar death trap, As a follow-up,
The 1975 Aston Allegro, mockingly christened the All-Agro by the long-suffering British public, is one of those cars that has gone down in history not merely as a failure, but as a rolling symbol of how badly the British car industry lost its way in the 1970s. When it launched, British Leyland confidently pitched it as the modern replacement for the legendary Aston 1100-1300, a car that had been one of the best-selling family vehicles in Britain. The Allegro, they promised, would carry that success into the new decade with futuristic design, modern engineering, and improved reliability. Instead, what they delivered was an abomination. Ugly, fragile, awkward, and so hated that its very name became shorthand for everything wrong with British motoring. The first impression was the styling, and it wasn't good. The Allegro's bulbous, bloated body looked like a melted jelly mold, with a droopy rear end and a face that seemed permanently miserable. Instead of the crisp, boxy lines that were becoming fashionable in Europe at the time, the Allegro was round in all the wrong places. Buyers stared at it in shock, wondering how anyone at British Leyland had signed off such a design. Children laughed at it, adults cringed, and even die-hard Aston loyalists admitted it was ugly as sin. In an era when the Volkswagen Golf, Renault 5, and Fiat 127 were showing that small cars could be sharp, stylish, and desirable, the Allegro looked like a bad cartoon. Then there was the infamous Quartic steering wheel, a square-shaped monstrosity that was meant to be innovative and modern. In reality, it was awkward to hold, uncomfortable to use, and completely pointless. Drivers hated it instantly. Within a couple of years, Aston quietly swapped it for a normal round wheel, but by then, the damage was done. The Quartic wheel became a national joke, proof that the Allegro was more gimmick than substance. Underneath, things weren't much better. The car was fitted with hydrogas suspension, which, in theory, should have provided a smooth ride. In practice, it was plagued with leaks, failures, and poor handling. Owners complained of bouncing, wallowing rides that made passengers carsick. The engines, borrowed from other British Leyland models, were underpowered, noisy, and unreliable. Head gaskets blew, gearboxes failed, and rust attacked the body almost as soon as it left the showroom. Breakdown services reported seeing Allegros stranded at the roadside more than almost any other car of the time. Fleet buyers, the bread and butter of British family cars, outright refused to take them, claiming the Allegro simply could not be relied upon to last through a normal service life. Taxi services in many towns and cities also avoided the Allegro like the plague. Some local councils even discouraged or banned them from taxi fleets because of their appalling unreliability and questionable safety record. Drivers who did try them quickly learned that they broke down so often customers were left stranded. The interior was cramped, poorly built, and riddled with squeaks and rattles from new. It was meant to be Britain's answer to the efficient, practical cars coming from Europe and Japan, but instead it was a rolling embarrassment. Socially, the Allegro was toxic. Unlike the Mini, which became a cultural icon, the Allegro became a punchline. Mechanics hated working on them because parts broke constantly, and owners hated owning them because repairs cost more than the car was worth. Even the British police and civil service, usually loyal customers of domestic cars, rejected the Allegro. Newspapers mocked it, comedians ridiculed it, and even some Aston dealers admitted privately that the car was a disaster. By the late 1970s, the Allegro's reputation was so bad that second-hand values collapsed. They became cheap bangers, bought only by people who had no other choice, and most ended up rotting away in scrapyards before they were even 10 years old. Today, it's a rare sight, not because they're collectible, but because most were simply scrapped in disgust. Survivors only exist because a few eccentric enthusiasts rescued them as ironic collector's items. The Allegro wasn't officially banned by governments, but it was banned by society itself. Fleet buyers banned it from their lots, taxi services banned it from their roads, and ordinary drivers banned it from their driveways. It is remembered now as one of the ugliest, most unreliable, and most derided cars Britain ever produced. In a single stroke, it managed to destroy the goodwill built up by Aston's earlier successful models and cemented British Leyland's reputation for incompetence. One owner summed it up perfectly years later. The Allegro wasn't a car. It was an affliction. You didn't buy one because you wanted it. You bought one because you'd lost all hope. Would you like me now to write an equally long, brutal breakdown of another British disaster like the Morris Marina, which some call the Allegro's only real rival for worst car Britain ever built?
The 1973 Triumph Stag occupies one of the darkest corners of British motoring history. A car that promised continental elegance and thrilling performance, but delivered little more than stress, broken hearts, and a deep mistrust of Triumph's engineering. Launched to compete with the likes of Jaguar E-Type and Mercedes SL, the Stag was pitched as a luxury roadster that could combine open-top freedom with straight-six power and the reliability of a well-engineered sports car. Instead, it became a cautionary tale, a symbol of the British car industry's slide into chaos during the 1970s, and a vehicle that mechanics secretly begged owners not to drive. At first glance, the Stag was stunning. Its long bonnet, flared wheel arches, and swooping lines made it look every bit the sports car it wanted to be. The removable hardtop allowed for grand touring or open-air cruising, and the cabin, trimmed in leather and wood veneer, promised comfort that few roadsters of the era could match. Triumph even managed to give it the kind of curb appeal that European markets found irresistible. Buyers, particularly in continental Europe, were drawn to the Stag's combination of looks, luxury, and the promise of British sports car sophistication. The illusion, however, began the moment you lifted the bonnet. Underneath the Stag's elegant exterior sat the Triumph-designed 3.0-liter V8, a power plant that was more ambitious on paper than practical in reality. Derived from the Triumph 2.5-liter straight-six architecture and stretched into a V8 configuration, it was supposed to deliver 145 horsepower and smooth, effortless torque. What it delivered instead was chronic overheating, head gasket failure, warped cylinder heads, and relentless maintenance issues. Even gentle driving could push it into thermal distress, especially in warm climates or congested traffic. Owners soon learned that any extended trip required constant monitoring of coolant levels, radiator hoses, and oil temperatures, a task that was tedious at best and impossible at worst. The consequences of these mechanical shortcomings were severe. Broken down Stags littered roadsides across Britain and Europe. Mechanics grew wary of the constant influx of stranded cars, and European rental fleets, which initially had considered the Stag a premium offering, blacklisted it almost immediately. In some countries, dealers refused to sell it, and export fleets quietly avoided it, knowing the potential liability of handing over a car that could literally overheat and leave drivers stranded on highways. The Stag's reputation spread quickly. It wasn't just unreliable, it was dangerous if you pushed it, and fragile if you didn't. Maintenance became an endless uphill battle. Triumph owners were warned to replace gaskets, tighten bolts, and check the cooling system obsessively. Even minor neglect could result in catastrophic engine failure. The chassis, while elegant and stiff for its class, was paired with suspension components that were ill-suited to the car's weight and power, leading to unpredictable handling and early wear. The Stag was a car where driving was always accompanied by anxiety, a perpetual worry that at any moment it might leave you stranded in the middle of nowhere. European markets, where Triumph hoped the Stag would establish its name as a competitor to Mercedes, reacted harshly. Rental companies refused to include it in fleets, fearing customer complaints, breakdowns, and the reputational risk of handing keys to a car that could literally fail at 70 miles per hour. Dealers quietly advised buyers in private to consider the Jaguar XJ6 or MGB GT instead. In many ways, the Stag was socially banned, not outlawed by law,
but rejected by insurance companies, fleet operators, and savvy buyers who didn't want the stress. Even today, the Triumph Stag is a car that inspires both admiration and dread. Its design is praised for beauty, and its V8 sound is intoxicating, but experienced collectors know the truth. It's a car that demands devotion, constant vigilance, and a deep bank account. Restoration projects often involve replacing the engine entirely, rebuilding cooling systems, and refurbishing fragile electrical systems. For every Stag on the road today, dozens more were scrapped, left in barns, or cannibalized for parts. Victims of Triumph's ambition outpacing its engineering capabilities. One owner once reflected on the Stag's brutal duality. It's the most beautiful, thrilling car you could ever own, but it's also a ticking time bomb. Drive it and you're in love. Stop, and it's already planning to break your heart. The Stag was banned not by law, but by reason, by insurance companies, and by the bitter lessons of mechanics across Europe who begged owners not to drive them. It remains one of the most infamous British luxury roadsters ever made, alluring, intoxicating, and utterly untrustworthy.
The 1976 Aston Princess, forever remembered as the Wedge of Misery, is one of the most infamous examples of British Leyland's collapse into mediocrity during the 1970s. Conceived as a replacement for the aging Austin Morris large family saloons, the Princess was meant to be modern, sleek, and technologically advanced. On paper, it looked like a forward-thinking car. Angular, wedge-shaped styling, hydraulic self-leveling suspension on certain trims, and a focus on interior comfort. In reality, it was an utter catastrophe, a car so poorly built, underpowered, and unsafe that it became a national joke almost immediately after launch. From the very first glance, the Princess was divisive. Its wedge-shaped styling was meant to be futuristic, but in practice it looked awkward and ungainly, a floating slab of metal with flat panels and strangely awkward proportions. The interior promised luxury, but delivered disappointment. Cheap plastics, awkward ergonomics, squeaks, rattles, and seats that sagged after a few months. The electronics and hydraulics, which were supposed to impress, often failed catastrophically. Drivers soon discovered that the advanced self-leveling suspension sometimes refused to work, leaving one end of the car higher than the other, or worse, sagging entirely and creating dangerous handling problems. Under the bonnet, the Princess was equally underwhelming. Engine options ranged from modest 4-cylinder units to the familiar B-Series 6, but none offered the power necessary to make the car feel confident on British roads. A fully loaded Princess with 4 passengers and luggage could feel lethargic, struggling to accelerate onto motorways while more nimble rivals easily overtook it. And while drivers were trying to coax any performance out of the car, they had to constantly worry about brakes that were soft and inconsistent, steering that felt numb, and an overall lack of structural integrity that would make even minor accidents far more serious than they should have been. Safety rumors followed the Princess almost immediately. Word spread that the wedge design, while angular and modern, failed crash tests catastrophically. Certain export markets allegedly refused to allow shipments of the Princess, concerned that in even low-speed collisions, the structure offered minimal protection to occupants. In the UK, this reinforced the vehicle's reputation. While other cars of the era were criticized for rust, unreliability, or poor handling, the Princess seemed to combine all of these faults with genuine danger. Mechanics and motoring journalists alike warned drivers to be cautious, and used car prices plummeted within a year of release. Socially, the Princess became a symbol of failure. It was mocked relentlessly in newspapers, car magazines, and by the public. Drivers of other British Leyland models treated it with disdain, and owning one was seen as a mark of desperation rather than taste. Taxi drivers, long-term fleet buyers, and government departments all avoided it. It was, in practice, banned from respectability. No one wanted it on their street, in their fleet, or in their garage. The nickname Wedge of Misery stuck,
encapsulating its appearance, its dreadful driving experience, and the constant headaches it caused owners. Even the tiniest victories could not save the Princess. Enthusiasts who tried to maintain or restore surviving examples constantly battled with parts shortages, failing hydraulics, and rust that appeared even on cars less than 5 years old. Its wedge shape, intended to be futuristic and sleek, often trapped moisture and accelerated corrosion, leaving the bodywork looking like a rotting box within a decade. Drivers would joke grimly that a Princess was only truly roadworthy when parked in a garage. The Aston Princess of 1976 was not merely a bad car, it was a comprehensive failure in engineering, design, safety, and social acceptance. It was technically legal to drive, but it was banned by common sense, by fleet managers, and by anyone with self-respect. To drive a Princess was to embrace misery at every corner. Slow acceleration, poor brakes, unreliable hydraulics, and the constant fear of structural collapse in even minor collisions. Its place in British motoring history is secure, but for all the wrong reasons. Today, surviving examples are rare, not because they were desirable, but because they were so poorly built that most did not survive. In short, the Princess wasn't just a car. It was a cautionary tale, a rolling embodiment of the decline of British Leyland. Its wedge shape might have looked bold, but it concealed a lethal combination of inept engineering, fragile structure, and relentless frustration for anyone unlucky enough to own one. As one ex-owner summarized bitterly decades later, the Princess promised the future, but delivered a lifetime of headaches, fear, and shame. If you want, I can do an even longer, cinematic deep dive into the Aston Princess, including stories of export bans, fleet rejections, and the psychological toll of owning one, turning it into a full, tragic saga of Britain's worst wedge-shaped disaster. Do you want me to do that?
The 1961 Vauxhall Victor FB is remembered not as a symbol of British engineering prowess, but as a cautionary tale of how ambition and reputation can be undone by careless design and manufacturing. Intended as a modern, practical family saloon, the FB Victor was supposed to compete with the Ford Consul and Aston Cambridge, offering middle-class families a reliable, stylish, and affordable car for everyday life. On paper, it seemed perfect. Contemporary styling with clean lines, a roomy interior, and a solid-sounding chassis. In reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen, and in the harsh climate of post-war Britain, the Victor's Achilles heel revealed itself almost immediately. The bodywork, though attractive at first glance, concealed a shocking vulnerability: rust. Vauxhall's steel and assembly methods were subpar, and the combination of untreated panels, poor undercoating, and the damp British weather meant that corrosion became catastrophic in record time. Owners reported that door sills, wheel arches, and even sections of the floor pan would start rotting within months. By the time most Victor FBs were 2 years old, entire panels were literally falling off. Rust holes appeared in the structural areas, compromising both the safety and the integrity of the car. Mechanics quickly learned that repairing a Victor FB was a never-ending battle. Welding new panels was expensive, laborious, and only a temporary fix because the corrosion had already spread into hidden areas. The engine and drivetrain, meanwhile, were only marginally better than the bodywork. The Victor was fitted with a modest 1.5-liter inline-4 engine producing about 55 horsepower, sufficient for quiet family transport, but utterly underwhelming for motorway travel. Acceleration was sluggish, the gearbox vague, and brakes, while conventional drum units, struggled to cope with wet roads, especially dangerous when combined with the car's tendency to lose structural integrity as the body rusted away. Steering was heavy at low speeds, and suspension components wore rapidly, making the ride harsh and unpredictable as the car aged. The problems became so severe that international authorities began taking notice.
Some European countries, particularly in Scandinavia and mainland Europe, banned the import of Victor FBs outright. Inspectors declared that they were structurally unsafe for road use, citing widespread corrosion that could lead to catastrophic failure in even minor collisions. Fleet buyers, rental companies, and taxi services in the UK quickly learned to avoid the Victor as well, fearing constant breakdowns, maintenance nightmares, and liability issues. In practical terms, the car was banned from serious use almost immediately after it hit the streets. Socially, the Victor's reputation became toxic. Families who purchased one found themselves constantly embarrassed, fielding questions from neighbors about why their doors were sagging or why the rear quarter panel had disappeared. Mechanics and motoring journalists openly ridiculed the car. One motoring magazine test report bluntly noted that the Victor FB was more suitable as a rusty sculpture than a family saloon. Roadside assistance calls for Victor FBs became a near-daily occurrence, and insurance companies treated them with suspicion, often charging higher premiums for vehicles with known structural issues. The car's combination of premature rust, weak performance, and questionable safety meant that ownership was a constant anxiety. Many early owners abandoned their Victors within a few years, selling them off cheaply or scrapping them entirely, leaving behind a trail of decayed shells that further cemented its reputation. Survivors today are almost entirely preserved by collectors who embrace its history as a curiosity. But even restored examples require constant vigilance against corrosion. In retrospect, the 1961 Vauxhall Victor FB stands as a textbook example of how a car can be banned by common sense rather than law. While technically legal to drive in Britain, its structural weakness, rapid deterioration, and safety hazards made it unsuitable for serious use on the roads. It wasn't just a failure of engineering, it was a failure of trust between manufacturer and buyer. Families who chose the Victor were left with a car that eroded literally and figuratively beneath them. And for decades, the name Victor FB was synonymous with shoddy build quality and inevitable breakdowns. In short, the Victor FB wasn't just unreliable. It was unsafe, embarrassing, and almost immediately ostracized from European roads. It remains a stark warning from automotive history. A beautiful-looking car can still be banned by reality itself when the fundamentals of safety, durability, and engineering are ignored. If you want, I can expand this into an even longer cinematic narrative showing the daily horror of owning a Victor FB in 1960s Britain, including its social stigma, the horror of rust spreading overnight, and the European import bans in vivid detail. Do you want me to do that?
The 1970s Hillman Imp is one of the most tragic examples of ambition, innovation, and British mismanagement colliding in the cruelest way possible. When it was first conceived, the Imp was supposed to be Roots Group's answer to the revolutionary Mini, a small, efficient, rear-engine city car that combined clever engineering, practicality, and style. Unlike the Mini, the Imp promised more power, better handling, and a hatchback-style layout with a proper trunk in front, giving it an innovative flair. On paper, it was brilliant. A lightweight aluminum engine tucked neatly over the rear axle, independent suspension on all four wheels, and a compact, nimble body that could zip through crowded British streets. In practice, it was a rolling nightmare. A car that turned owner enthusiasm into despair, and by the mid-1970s was effectively banned from reliability, fleet services, and even some export markets. The heart of the problem lay in the Imp's 875cc rear-mounted aluminum engine. Aluminum was lightweight, which helped with weight distribution, but it was soft, prone to warping, and unforgiving when the cooling system failed, which it frequently did. Overheating became a daily worry, especially in warmer weather or slow traffic. Even minimal neglect could result in a catastrophic head gasket failure, warped heads, or seized pistons. Owners quickly learned that the Imp demanded near-constant attention. Valves had to be adjusted obsessively, the cooling system checked constantly, and oil levels monitored at every stop. This wasn't ownership, it was near full-time babysitting. But the engine was only the beginning. The Imp's gearbox was fragile, often whining, with synchros that wore out quickly, making shifts stiff, noisy, and occasionally impossible without grinding gears. Suspension components, while theoretically advanced with independent setups, wore unevenly and were prone to breaking under normal driving conditions. Brakes, adequate when new, deteriorated quickly, especially on damp or busy streets. The body, while compact and stylish, suffered from rust in vulnerable areas such as the sills, floor pan, and wheel arches, sometimes within 2 years of purchase. A modest amount of rain, combined with poor underbody protection, could render the car structurally compromised, leaving the driver facing a safety hazard instead of a simple city runabout. By the mid-1970s, the Imp's reputation had reached legendary levels for all the wrong reasons. Fleet operators, including rental companies, government departments, and small businesses, recognized the car as a liability. Insurance companies treated it as a high-risk vehicle due to mechanical failures and structural fragility. In some European countries, import restrictions effectively blacklisted the Imp. Safety inspectors noted that its fragile aluminum engine and corroding body panels made it structurally unsafe for sustained road use. Dealers quietly advised potential buyers to look elsewhere. Mechanics groaned at the sight of it, and the public increasingly mocked anyone seen driving one. In practical terms, the Hillman Imp was banned from trust, reliability, and respectability long before it disappeared from the roads. Driving an Imp was a constant psychological trial. Even in good condition, the car demanded vigilance. One had to constantly monitor temperature gauges, listen for engine knocks, and plan trips with contingency routes in case of breakdowns. A sudden loss of power on a motorway or a blown head gasket in traffic could strand a driver in the middle of nowhere. Rain, snow, or even mild dampness could accelerate corrosion in critical areas, further compromising safety. The car required meticulous maintenance, a dedication most owners found exhausting or impossible to sustain. A common joke at the time was that owning an Imp means learning to live in constant fear. The social stigma was just as severe. Unlike the Mini, which was embraced as a symbol of clever, efficient British engineering, the Imp became a symbol of frustration and misfortune. Children pointed, neighbors laughed, and other drivers viewed it as a broken-down experiment on wheels. Even enthusiasts who tried to enjoy its nimble handling often did so with one eye on the rear engine, fearing a catastrophic failure at any moment. Repair shops quickly learned that fixing one Imp was a constant exercise in frustration. Parts were delicate, sometimes unavailable, and failures frequent. Owners many abandoned the cars entirely, scrapping them within a few years and leaving rusting shells in fields and garages across Britain. Yet, despite all these flaws, the Hillman Imp still retains a certain charm in retrospect. When it worked, truly worked, it could be lively, nimble, and surprisingly fun to drive. The rear engine layout allowed for excellent traction in slippery conditions, and its small size made it ideal for city driving when it wasn't breaking down. For those rare instances when the engine and chassis behaved, the Imp could almost feel like a miniature sports car, teasing drivers with the potential that its engineering promised, but almost never delivered reliably. The Hillman Imp is ultimately a car banned, not by law, but by reality itself. Fleet operators, insurers, and export authorities treated it as a liability. Everyday drivers avoided it if they could. Ownership meant living in near constant anxiety with the fear that any journey could end in mechanical disaster. Its rear-mounted aluminum engine, delicate suspension, and body prone to corrosion made it unsuitable for ordinary use. The Imp was ambitious, clever, and innovative, but it was also brutally unforgiving. A car that punished any lack of diligence with catastrophic consequences. It was a marvel on paper, a joke on the road, and a nightmare in the driveway. In the end, the 1970s Hillman Imp is remembered not just as unreliable, but as a car that was socially, practically, and mechanically banned from success. It's a testament to how ambition without execution can create a vehicle that is technically legal, but universally avoided. A car that is fascinating, rare, and even celebrated today by enthusiasts, precisely because surviving one feels like a victory over history. If you want, I can write an even longer cinematic deep dive into the Hillman Imp story, detailing individual owner horror stories, fleet and export bans, roadside catastrophes, and the full societal shame of owning one, turning it into a truly epic narrative of Britain's rear-engine tragedy. Do you want me to do that?
The 1975 Lotus Elite Series 2 is a perfect example of a car that promised elegance, performance, and British engineering flair, but delivered frustration, danger, and relentless disappointment instead. Lotus, already famous for its lightweight sports cars and racing pedigree, aimed with the Elite Series 2 to create a sophisticated GT, a car that combines striking, aerodynamic lines with agile handling and a comfortable 2+2 layout. In concept, it was brilliant. A fiberglass monocoque body designed to be both ultra-lightweight and stiff, wrapped around Lotus's renowned handling geometry. In practice, it was a mechanical, structural, and legal headache that quickly earned a reputation as a vehicle banned by common sense, buyer confidence, and even regulatory authorities in several markets. From the moment buyers opened the door, the Elite's flaws became apparent. The interior, which Lotus promised would be refined and luxurious, was cheap, fragile, and prone to rapid decay. Dash plastics warped, upholstery split, and trim panels detached after just months of normal use. Even basic features like window regulators, door locks, and switches failed repeatedly, leaving owners constantly battling electrical gremlins. The dashboard, intended to reflect Lotus's racing precision, became a source of endless complaints as gauges malfunctioned, warning lights blinked inconsistently, and wiring loomed behind panels like a spaghetti nightmare waiting to short-circuit. The fiberglass body, which was supposed to be a technological marvel, proved to be another Achilles heel. While lightweight and aerodynamically beautiful, it was brittle and prone to cracking. Minor impacts, flexing under torsion, or even normal vibration over uneven roads could produce hairline fractures that spread quickly. Panels warped under the sun, doors began misaligning, and repairing fiberglass was far from trivial. Structural integrity, the very thing that should define a GT, was called into question, making the Elite unsafe at higher speeds or on long journeys. Several buyers pursued legal action against Lotus for producing what they considered a defective and hazardous vehicle, adding to the car's notoriety. Mechanically, the Elite fared no better. Electrical issues were chronic and relentless. Headlight motors failed, ignition systems misfired, and the car's complex array of small switches and relays left owners constantly troubleshooting. Suspension components, while designed for sporty handling, wore rapidly and contributed to unpredictable behavior on the road, especially when paired with the fragile body. Reliability was so poor that several markets required Lotus to recall or even restrict sales in response to safety concerns, further tarnishing its image as a serious grand tour. Insurance companies treated the Series 2 Elite warily, and owners quickly realized that driving it required both vigilance and mechanical intuition. Socially, the Elite Series 2 was treated with skepticism, ridicule, and outright avoidance. Despite its exotic looks, drivers were seen as either masochists or unlucky individuals cursed with an inherently flawed vehicle. Fleet sales, government importers, and even private collectors approached the Elite cautiously, often opting for safer, more reliable alternatives from Jaguar or Aston Martin. In effect, the car was banned from being respected as a legitimate grand tour. It looked the part, but could not function in the role it was designed for. Owners often reported embarrassment when showing the car to friends or at club meets, as they had to explain every crack, malfunction, and electrical failure. Even today, the Lotus Elite Series 2 is remembered as both alluring and cursed. Surviving examples are prized largely by enthusiasts who are prepared to invest significant time and money into keeping one roadworthy, restoring not just the mechanical parts, but the delicate fiberglass and interior components that were so prone to failure. When running perfectly, the Elite is still a lightweight, agile GT with remarkable cornering and visual appeal. But achieving that level of perfection is rare, and even then, the constant vigilance required reminds drivers of its flawed pedigree. In short, the 1975 Lotus Elite Series 2 was a car banned, not by law, but by practicality, buyer trust, and regulatory scrutiny. Its fiberglass body cracked under normal use, its electrics failed constantly, and the interior deteriorated in months. Safety recalls and lawsuits followed, ensuring that the Elite could never be taken seriously as a grand tourer, no matter how beautiful it looked on the outside. It remains a cautionary tale. Elegance, engineering ambition, and style cannot mask fragility, unreliability, and danger. If you want, I can write an even longer cinematic version of the Lotus Elite Series 2 story, detailing individual buyer nightmares, court cases, European recalls, and the psychological toll of owning a car that looked like a GT but was functionally banned from serious driving. Do you want me to do that?
The 1959 Aston FX3 Taxi is often remembered today as a nostalgic symbol of London streets, but its early life was a near catastrophe for drivers, passengers, and regulators alike. Conceived as the next step in the evolution of the London black cab, the FX3 was supposed to be a reliable, comfortable, and practical workhorse, capable of carrying multiple passengers with luggage while handling the cramped, winding streets of the city. On paper, it promised everything a professional taxi driver could want: a roomy interior, a tall, spacious passenger compartment, and an engine and chassis sturdy enough to endure constant stop-and-go urban traffic. In reality, the FX3 was an exercise in frustration, mechanical failure, and daily anxiety, so severe that authorities and drivers alike treated it as if it were effectively banned from safe, reliable service. From the first week on the road, the FX3 revealed its flaws. The 2.2-liter Aston four-cylinder engine, though designed for endurance, proved temperamental under the constant strain of city driving. Overheating was frequent, particularly during summer months or in slow-moving traffic, leading to warped cylinder heads and blown gaskets. Oil leaks were practically standard, and engine misfires were a constant headache for drivers who relied on every cylinder to keep their business moving. The gearbox was clunky and unforgiving, often grinding when shifting, and the brakes, originally designed for moderate loads, wore unevenly and lost effectiveness under heavy or continuous use. Every journey required vigilance. Drivers had to monitor temperature gauges constantly, listen for unusual knocks or squeaks, and plan trips with contingency routes in case of mechanical failure. Suspension issues compounded the misery. The FX3's suspension, though theoretically robust, struggled under repeated stress. Fully loaded with passengers and luggage, the cab would sag, bounce, and rattle violently over cobblestones and potholes. Steering, while precise in theory, felt heavy and unresponsive in practice, particularly on the narrow streets of London. Minor impacts or bumps could exacerbate existing mechanical weaknesses, making the car unpredictable and at times dangerous to drive. Within months, drivers reported failures ranging from broken suspension arms to jammed steering linkages, and body panels would loosen or rattle from constant vibration. The social and professional impact was immediate. Taxi drivers, whose livelihood depended on reliability, were forced into a constant cycle of repairs, downtime, and lost income. Fleet managers and taxi associations openly criticized the FX3, pushing authorities to restrict licenses until the model could be replaced or its safety improved. Complaints about breakdowns, overheating engines, and unsafe suspension led some regulatory bodies to treat the FX3 as unfit for service. Certain municipal authorities even placed informal bans on its use in public fleets until more dependable replacements arrived. The car's mechanical failures weren't just an inconvenience, they were a threat to the business, safety, and reputation of every driver unlucky enough to own one. Passengers too suffered. Sitting in the back of an FX3 was a gamble. The cabin was noisy, often hot from a poorly ventilated engine bay, and prone to shaking from faulty suspension. On wet or uneven roads, the FX3 could feel unstable, unnerving even experienced Londoners. The small victories of a smooth ride were outweighed by the constant reminders that the car could fail at any moment, leaving passengers stranded or delayed.
Families, tourists, and business people learned quickly that choosing an FX3 meant accepting unpredictability and mechanical anxiety as part of the journey. By the mid-1960s, as the FX4 replaced it, the FX3's reputation was cemented. Its successor addressed nearly every flaw, from engine reliability and suspension robustness to overall safety and comfort. Meanwhile, surviving FX3s were gradually withdrawn from central London service, relegated to rural routes, private use, or the scrapyard. Drivers and fleet operators looked back on the FX3 not with nostalgia, but with grim humor and relief that it was finally replaced. Stories of stranded passengers, overheated engines, and broken gearboxes became urban legend, a cautionary tale of how even an iconic brand can fail spectacularly when engineering, design, and real-world use collide. In retrospect, the Aston FX3 was effectively banned long before the FX4 replaced it, not by law, but by common sense, professional necessity, and regulatory pressure. Taxi drivers avoided it where possible. Authorities restricted its licenses, and passengers treated it warily. Ownership meant near-constant worry, endless repairs, and the fear that a routine journey could become a mechanical disaster. Yet, despite its flaws, the FX3 remains a fascinating part of London's automotive history, an emblem of a bygone era when ambition, necessity, and poor execution collided to produce a car that was technically legal, yet functionally shunned. If you want, I can create an even longer cinematic deep dive, turning the FX3 story into a dramatic narrative with first-hand driver accounts, tales of breakdowns on rainy London streets, regulatory battles, and the social humiliation of owning one. A full-scale tragic saga of Britain's most infamous taxi. Do you want me to do that?
The 1971 Morris Marina is one of the most infamous failures in British automotive history. A car that perfectly illustrates how ambition, corporate mismanagement, and cost-cutting can combine to produce a vehicle so fundamentally flawed that it becomes a running joke, a mechanical nightmare, and in many ways, a car banned by practicality, common sense, and even regulatory authorities. Conceived by British Leyland as a direct competitor to the Ford Cortina, the Marina was meant to dominate the family car market, offering simplicity, affordability, and classic British saloon sensibilities. On paper, it ticked all the right boxes: rear-wheel drive, conventional engine layouts, a roomy interior for passengers, and styling that was blandly functional but marketable. In reality, it was a disaster from almost every perspective, structurally, mechanically, and socially. From the moment it rolled off the production line, the Marina betrayed the compromises that went into its creation. Build quality was atrocious. Panels were misaligned, doors didn't shut cleanly, and gaps between bodywork sections were inconsistent, allowing water and debris to seep in and accelerate corrosion. The paint was thin and prone to flaking, while sills, wheel arches, and underbody panels succumbed to rust almost immediately, sometimes within months of leaving the factory. Within a year, it wasn't uncommon to see Marinas with visible holes in the floorboards or rust streaking down the side panels, giving the impression that they had been abandoned rather than new cars just sold from a showroom. Even in the early 1970s, these problems were severe enough that some export countries refused to import them, citing safety and structural concerns. Mechanically, the Marina offered little relief. Its engines, small four-cylinder units designed for economy rather than performance, were underpowered, prone to overheating, and finicky in operation. Oil leaks were common, and head gaskets frequently failed under normal urban driving. Gearboxes were clunky and prone to grinding, while clutches wore out prematurely due to poor materials and frequent misuse, which was inevitable given the car's stop-and-go city usage. Steering was vague and imprecise, especially at higher speeds, while the suspension, though conventional in design, was soft, underdamped, and susceptible to rapid wear. On corners, the Marina would wallow, understeer, and feel dangerously unstable, particularly loaded with passengers or luggage. Drivers often reported that even small potholes or uneven road surfaces could make the car unpredictable, forcing them to drive cautiously at all times. The Marina's flaws were compounded by social and professional consequences. Taxi associations, fleet operators, and delivery companies initially looked at the Marina as a potential workhorse, but the reality of daily breakdowns, unreliable components, and rapidly rusting bodies quickly led them to abandon it. Drivers hated it, passengers complained, and insurance companies treated it warily, sometimes increasing premiums due to the car's known safety risks. In some regions, particularly overseas, regulatory authorities imposed restrictions or outright bans on importing or licensing the Marina because of recurring safety and durability concerns. Even in the UK, authorities and fleet managers unofficially discouraged its use, warning drivers that a Marina was a gamble with both safety and livelihood. Ownership of a Marina was a constant struggle. Routine trips could devolve into mechanical disasters. A worn gearbox might jam on a busy street. A seized engine could leave a family stranded, or rusted suspension components could fail unexpectedly. Repairs were expensive, and spare parts, while available, were of uneven quality, often compounding rather than resolving problems. The car demanded obsessive maintenance. Oil checks, gasket replacements, and suspension inspections became daily rituals for those trying to keep it running. Even with diligent care, breakdowns were common, leaving owners anxious, frustrated, and socially embarrassed. Socially, the Marina became a punchline almost immediately. Motorists mocked its uninspired styling. Journalists ridiculed its performance and reliability, and mechanics groaned whenever one appeared in their workshops. Drivers were often embarrassed to be seen in a Marina, aware that any moment could expose the car's flaws to the world. It became a symbol not of British automotive excellence, but of British Leyland's mismanagement, corner-cutting, and failure to deliver on promises. Even the company's own engineers reportedly admitted that the Marina was a compromise too far, blending cost-saving measures with design shortcuts that no amount of clever marketing could disguise. Despite all this, a few Marinas survive today, largely as historical curiosities or collector's oddities. They are reminders of a time when corporate ambition, national pride, and poor execution collided to produce vehicles that were technically legal, but practically avoided. Driving one in its heyday required patience, vigilance, and near-constant readiness for breakdowns, effectively banning it from being a reliable, safe, or enjoyable family car. Every journey was a gamble. The engine might overheat, the brakes could fail, or rusted structural components could compromise safety. For most owners, the car's flaws outweighed any practical benefits, and many abandoned or scrapped their vehicles after only a few years of ownership. In the end, the 1971 Morris Marina stands as a cautionary tale in British automotive history. It was ambitious but poorly executed, functional in theory but catastrophic in practice. It was a family car that was banned by common sense, fleet operators, delivery companies, and even everyday drivers, not because it was illegal, but because it was unsafe, unreliable, and socially unacceptable. The Marina represents a period when British Leyland's desire to compete with the Ford Cortina and other rivals collided with production incompetence, cost-cutting, and engineering shortcuts that created a vehicle that failed on almost every level. It is remembered today not for innovation or style, but for rust, mechanical disasters, and the lessons learned from trying to make a car that should have been simple, but turned into a rolling symbol of failure. If you want, I can write an even longer, fully immersive, cinematic deep dive into the Morris Marina saga, including first-hand owner horror stories, catastrophic rust incidents, export bans, fleet disasters, social ridicule, and daily life trying to survive behind the wheel of one. A tragic epic of Britain's most notorious family car. Do you want me to do that?
The 1980s Reliant Rialto is a vehicle whose very existence seems to defy logic, a mechanical and social oddity that inherited all the instability, unreliability, and public scorn of its predecessor, the Reliant Robin, and then amplified it in a supposedly modernized form. Designed as a tiny, lightweight urban car, The Rialto was aimed at buyers who wanted minimal running costs, a quirky alternative to conventional city cars, and the novelty of owning a three-wheeler. In reality, it was a car that existed on the edge of legality, practicality, and common sense. A vehicle so fundamentally flawed that it became banned in every sense that mattered, socially, mechanically, and legally. Insurers refused coverage. Authorities frowned on its road use, and drivers lived in constant fear that one wrong turn could turn a normal commute into a catastrophe. The Rialto's handling was its most obvious and dangerous flaw. Its single front wheel, combined with a short wheelbase and lightweight fiberglass body, made cornering a perilous activity. At even modest speeds, a sharp turn could cause the car to tip or roll. Wet roads, sudden gusts of wind, or potholes became amplified threats. Drivers reported that the Rialto could react unpredictably to even minor steering inputs. Highways were effectively forbidden territory, as the car was prone to fishtailing and instability in crosswinds. Even slow urban driving carried risks, with the constant fear of losing control looming over every journey. The vehicle's modernized suspension offered little mitigation, and every patch of uneven tarmac or cobblestone became a reminder that physics, not engineering, ruled the Rialto. Crash performance, if it can be called that, was non-existent. The fiberglass shell provided almost no protection to occupants, lacking crumple zones, reinforced frames, or even basic structural rigidity. Minor bumps could deform panels or damage the chassis, and serious collisions could be deadly. Local authorities quickly realized that this tiny, ultralight three-wheeler could create more harm than conventional cars in an accident. Insurance companies took note. Many refused to cover the Rialto entirely, citing high risk and liability concerns. Without insurance, the car was legally undrivable on public roads, effectively banning it from everyday use in most practical scenarios. Mechanical reliability was equally abysmal. The rear-mounted 748cc engine was marginally capable of moving the car, but hills, passenger weight, or longer trips often exposed its limitations. Gearboxes were crude and prone to failure. Brakes offered minimal stopping power, and the wiring and electrical systems were rudimentary at best. Fiberglass panels, while lightweight, cracked easily, especially under stress or after minor bumps, and replacement parts were scarce or inconsistently manufactured. Owners had to become quasi-mechanics, constantly adjusting, fixing, and improvising just to keep the car operational. The Rialto demanded vigilance, patience, and mechanical ingenuity, turning routine driving into a stressful daily ordeal. Socially, the car was treated with derision. Its strange, bulbous shape, tiny dimensions, and three-wheeled instability made it the butt of jokes among motorists and pedestrians alike. Taxi associations, fleet operators, and delivery companies avoided it entirely, while urban planners and local authorities unofficially discouraged its presence on city streets. Even enthusiasts who enjoyed the quirkiness of three-wheelers had to admit that the Rialto was largely impractical for serious use. Its road manners, crash vulnerability, and mechanical fragility made it a vehicle to be admired from afar, but feared in practice. The Rialto's practical banning extended beyond insurance and social stigma. Many cities unofficially discouraged it in traffic-heavy zones, school areas, and highways, effectively limiting where it could be used safely. Owners often found themselves restricted to suburban streets or private property, as the combination of instability, poor crash performance, and lack of insurance made more ambitious driving impossible. Even today, surviving Rialtos are cherished mostly as collectors' curiosities, rarities that survived not because they were functional, but because someone had the patience, obsession, and love of absurdity to maintain them. In sum, the 1980s Reliant Rialto is an object lesson in automotive folly. It attempted to modernize a concept that was already borderline insane, resulting in a car that was socially mocked, mechanically fragile, and legally constrained. Drivers lived with constant anxiety. Insurers refused coverage. Authorities frowned on its road use, and passengers often sat nervously in the back, aware that a minor misjudgment could turn a short journey into a disaster. The Rialto's legacy is one of danger disguised as novelty. A three-wheeled experiment that was legally allowed but effectively banned from practical, safe, or serious use. Its story is a reminder that quirkiness and efficiency cannot substitute for stability, protection, or reliability, and that some vehicles exist only to terrify, frustrate, and amuse in equal measure. If you want, I can create an ultra-long, fully cinematic deep dive version of the Reliant Rialto saga, with first-hand accounts from terrified drivers, detailed insurance horror stories, rollover incidents, regulatory restrictions, and the surreal social humiliation of owning one. A complete epic of Britain's most infamous three-wheeled car. Do you want me to do that?
The 1974 Jensen Healey was supposed to be Britain's answer to the growing market for affordable, exciting sports cars. A roadster that could blend style, performance, and accessibility in one sleek package. With its low-slung profile, fiberglass and steel bodywork, and Lotus engine pedigree, the car promised everything an enthusiast could dream of. Nimble handling, spirited acceleration, and the visceral pleasure of an open-top drive. On paper, it sounded perfect. A lightweight British sports car with Italian-inspired aesthetics, Lotus engineering, and a price tag that was just attainable enough to appeal to aspirational buyers. In practice, it was a disaster of almost unprecedented proportions. A car so unreliable, unsafe, and plagued by defects that it was effectively banned from serious sales and widespread ownership in the United States, and universally shunned in Europe by anyone who valued sanity, safety, or financial stability. The Jensen Healey's problems began at its heart, the Lotus-designed 2.0-liter inline-4 engine. Although capable of delivering lively performance and a satisfying exhaust note when functioning correctly, the engine was notoriously temperamental. Cooling systems were poorly engineered, resulting in frequent overheating that could warp cylinder heads, blow gaskets, or ruin pistons within a few thousand miles. Oil leaks were a near-constant complaint, and several cars even suffered engine fires, sometimes catastrophic. These incidents were not isolated, but recurring, and they haunted early buyers who had expected the reliability typical of cars costing a similar premium. The very engine meant to inspire confidence instead became a source of anxiety. Any spirited drive could be the one that would send the car into a mechanical crisis. Compounding the engine woes was the gearbox, which was poorly matched to the engine's output and the car's lightweight chassis. Early Jensen Healeys were plagued by failing synchromesh units, grinding gears, and stiff, imprecise shifters. The combination of a high-strung engine and a fragile gearbox meant that drivers had to handle the car delicately, despite the allure of speed and sharp handling. One missed downshift or aggressive maneuver could instantly turn a pleasurable drive into a tense ordeal, leaving drivers staring helplessly as the car resisted their commands. In many ways, the gearbox failures were emblematic of the broader mechanical chaos that plagued the car. Everything worked in theory, but failed in practice. The electrical system was a further nightmare. Dash instruments flickered or failed entirely, lighting systems malfunctioned without warning, and the ignition was prone to cutting out mid-drive. Even minor repairs required hours of troubleshooting due to inconsistent wiring and substandard components. Mechanically fragile and electrically unpredictable, the Jensen Healey turned routine driving into a high-stress exercise. Owners soon learned that preventative maintenance was not merely a recommendation, it was an absolute necessity, and even that was no guarantee against failure. In the United States, these mechanical failures were compounded by regulatory and legal hurdles. By the mid-1970s, emissions standards tightened, forcing multiple recalls and modifications to keep the cars compliant. The Jensen Healey struggled to meet these requirements. Catalytic converters, modified carburetors, and emissions-tuned engines further reduced performance and reliability, exacerbating the car's mechanical frustrations. Dealers quickly realized that selling the car was more trouble than it was worth. Many potential buyers walked away, unwilling to invest in a car that was likely to spend more time in the repair shop than on the road. In effect, the combination of recalls, compliance difficulties, and rampant reliability issues made the Jensen Healey effectively banned from the mainstream market. It existed legally, but was impossible to own sensibly. Even the car's social reception was hostile. Journalists lambasted its unreliability. Magazines warned of fires and gearbox failures, and word of mouth ensured that buyers approached the Jensen Healey with extreme caution. Owners who did purchase one often found themselves isolated in a network of fellow enthusiasts, constantly sharing horror stories about breakdowns, fires, and electrical chaos. Mechanics groaned whenever one appeared in the garage, while roadside assistance teams prepared for frequent, urgent calls. Onlookers mocked its awkward proportions compared to the sleek and well-engineered competitors of the era. The Jensen Healey, while visually attractive, quickly became synonymous with danger, expense, and regret. Perhaps worst of all, the car's failures were cumulative. A cooling system prone to overheating stressed the engine, which in turn stressed the gearbox, while electrical faults made diagnosing problems nearly impossible. Fires, gear failures, and minor accidents became almost inevitable, creating a car whose very design seemed to invite disaster. In the United States, some states even unofficially discouraged its registration due to safety concerns, and insurance companies treated it as high risk, in some cases refusing coverage altogether. Owning one required constant vigilance, mechanical skill, and nerves of steel. Many buyers quickly abandoned the car, and dealerships quietly stopped promoting it. The Jensen Healey's legacy is a study in contrasts. It had potential for brilliance, combining Lotus engineering, British styling, and lightweight agility into a package that could have been a cult classic. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about ambition without execution. A car that could thrill on paper, but terrified in reality. Fires, gearbox failures, electrical chaos, and regulatory entanglements made it impossible for the Jensen Healey to succeed as a road-going sports car. Collectors today may treasure surviving examples, not for reliability or performance, but as historical oddities, a reminder of a car that burned brightly, albeit briefly, before collapsing under the weight of its own flaws. In the end, the 1974 Jensen Healey stands as one of Britain's most tragic sports cars, a vehicle designed to excite, to inspire, and to compete, yet ultimately undone by poor engineering, regulatory headaches, and relentless mechanical failure. It was effectively banned from widespread adoption, shunned by insurers, regulators, and everyday drivers alike. Those who survived behind its wheel experienced the thrill of a true roadster only when the car cooperated, but more often endured frustration, danger, and humiliation. It remains a testament to what can happen when ambition is not matched by execution. A beautifully styled disaster that burned brightly, albeit briefly, on the roads of Britain and America alike. If you want, I can write an even longer, ultra-detailed, cinematic, epic version of the Jensen Healey's story, covering individual owner horror stories, documented engine fires, gearbox failures, U.S. recall battles, regulatory bans, social ridicule, and the slow death of the model as a legitimate sports car, turning it into a full-scale tragic saga of Britain's most cursed roadster of the 1970s. Do you want me to do that?